So why did you get into medcoms?
Why did I get into medcoms? Well, I would have got into medcoms about 30 years ago. I was working at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. I'd done clinical research, sales, marketing, and I was quite interested in the whole sort of medical education side of what I was doing as a product manager. I was less interested in advertising, less interested in PR, and quite interested in what was in those days known as med-ed. So it was running communication programs and educational programs at a more technical end maybe than advertising and PR. And in those days it was called med-ed. So I joined a med-ed agency, and somewhere over the years that terminology changed a little bit, and a lot of people now talk more in terms of medical communications, or as I call it, medcoms. And as I say, medcoms for me is defined as not PR, not advertising. It's the technical end of the spectrum. We tend to work at an international level on things like publications, planning, events and so on, dealing a lot with the opinion leaders. And why did I get into it? Because I liked the science, I liked the communications, and I liked doing things at that sort of program level.
What advice would you give to someone looking for a career in medcoms?
Well, I think coming to medcoms can provide people with a great career, frankly, particularly if you take people like in academia who like the science but perhaps don't like pipetting. Medcoms provides a great opportunity to deal with science and to talk with the world's leading experts in a subject, and to be creative. A lot of people think of medcoms as not being very creative, but it is quite a creative way. What you're trying to do is develop a program, communicate a message, and it's not as simple as writing it down and presenting a piece of paper to somebody. Depending on the individual, medcoms can take you all over the world, and a lot of people get into medical communications because they can travel, they can meet some interesting people, and they can deal with the science. I think it's the science that turns people on.
How has medcoms changed since you started?
How's medcoms changed since I started? Quite a lot. It was very much a projects-based business when I started, as I say, with med-ed, which is still a term that's used today. Medcoms, medical communications, is much more, I think, program-based, much more strategic these days. And of course, technology's had a huge impact. So nowadays, medical writers and so on in medcoms aren't just writing for publication in a book. They're writing for websites. They're writing blogs. They're writing scripts for people to do videos and all sorts of things. And the communication opportunities these days, in terms of the internet allowing you to broadcast to more people, it changes the way in which a lot of things are done. But at its core, I'm not sure how much has changed. At its core, it's still about the scientific, the communication of science to your audience, be that an opinion leader or a GP or a patient or any one of a number of other groups. You're still thinking in terms of what you're trying to say to that group of people and what is the most the optimal way of saying it.
Where do you see medcoms in the next 5 years?
Where do I see medcoms going in the next 5 years? I think there's a couple of ways of answering that question. One is at a sort of strategic level. I think medcoms is coming into its own. That's to do with the industry, pharma industry, having to be so much more transparent, so much more rigorous in its communications. It brings challenges with it, but the days of advertising, for example, advertising in the old sense of the world, is a bit old-fashioned. We're now talking about medical communications, communicating science earlier in the drug life cycle, in very transparent, very rigorous sort of ways. But you can also ask the question in a different sort of way, practically speaking. Where's medcoms going? Who's going to do the writing? There's an awful lot of medical writing that needs to be done now. There's all sorts of pressures on drug companies to publish data and be open with their data. Well, that's got to be written up and so on. But there's a big problem in medical communications, or a challenge in medical communications, as people become available elsewhere in the world to do that working, that medical writing, as just one sort of simple example, perhaps not a great example in some ways, but as you know, lots of people now are talking about offshoring. I don't like the term offshoring, outsourcing medical writing to India and so on. You know, that's actually providing quite a big challenge to medcoms in the way that medcoms agencies are working, and it'll be very interesting to see how that aspect works over the next 5 years.
How do you think digital has impacted the sector?
Well, clearly, how has digital impacted the sector? It's impacted the sector hugely. Some of us argue that a lot of medical communications activities need to embrace digital more, but you know, none of us can get away from the fact that that sharing information these days online and via forums and so on has changed the dynamics, basically. And I personally am less interested in the gizmos and the bells and the whistles than I am simply in the fact that you can now provide information, publish it once, as it were, and people all over the world in theory can access it. That's changed quite a lot of the dynamics of the marketplace, I think, and opened up the possibilities hugely. So, you know, in medcoms, you're writing websites, you're producing proceedings from meetings and so on that you can put up online and everyone can access it via the whatever community and so on. And that's very different from the old days where you'd produce an 8-page newspaper and try and figure out how to send it to all the people you wanted to, and so on and so forth. So that's interesting. I think in terms of digital, obviously is about personal, one-to-one type engagement, which sort of changes a lot of things at all sorts of different levels. And if you look in medical education, and if you go into sort of real education, the opportunities there for e-learning and so on, again, they wouldn't be there without the technology. Quite how medical communications as a business handles all that and makes most use of it, I think is probably still something for to be seen, as it were. But there's no doubt a lot of interesting things can be done online, which change the way you do it, but changes the dynamics, changes the cost base from which you do it, and so on. Opens up the access to information, which is after all what we're about.
What do you think of bad pharma?
What do I think of bad pharma? Well, what do I think of bad pharma? The book. I think it's very misunderstood at the moment. I've been quite public in some of my comment about it. We had Ben come along and talk at a couple of the Medcoms meetings last year, and before the publication of the book. And since the publication of the book, I, for one, have been recommending that people read it. I'm not on a commission, but I do think it's important that those of us in this business read it, because the problem is a lot of the headlines, I think, are slightly misleading. What Ben's saying in Bad Pharma is that the system for developing drugs and communicating information about drugs is broken, and I agree with that, and I think a lot of people have argued the same point for a long time. What Ben has done is he's got it very dramatically out into the public arena. Yes, it's called Bad Pharma, and yes, a big chunk of the book is attacking pharma, if you like, but that's because they're one of the biggest players in the game. But he isn't just attacking pharma, and I think a lot of people have seen Bad Pharma, seen the headlines within the industry, and have sort of just assumed it's attacking pharma, and therefore, why take it seriously? I think people should read the book. I think people should listen to it, and yes, I think people should take it on board, his argument. What I find interesting is that as an industry, I think we're tending to put our heads in the sand a little bit, and I think that's wrong. What I think is interesting alongside that is that he's elevated the discussion to such a high level so fast, and he's acted as a bit of a magnet for some of the people who wanted to get this done. So we now have the Houses of questions in the House. We had the meeting last week with the EMEA talking about data transparency, and I think that's really quite interesting from Medcom's point of view. I think it's really very interesting. How do you handle that? This transparency is all very well and good, but the fact that doctors are now having to be much more transparent about what they're doing, industry being more transparent about what they're doing with doctors, gets a lot of stuff out into the public arena which wasn't there before, which will make some people feel uncomfortable. But fundamentally, if you come back to Bad Pharma, this whole point about missing data and so on is very real, and most of us would agree that something needs to be done about it. As I say, Ben has put a very strong spotlight on that, and it's happened very, very quickly. My own view is over the next 6 months an awful lot more is going to happen. So I'm a fan of the book, whilst I think it's very, very uncomfortable reading, but my basic message is, at least to people in the business, go and read the book and then debate it, rather than just react to the headlines. It's quite important.
What is the most exciting thing happening in medcoms at the
Well,
moment?
if you ask me what the most exciting thing happening in medcoms at the moment is, I would basically say it's this whole discussion about transparency of data, which I would argue has been going on for a while, but Ben has put it into the public arena, and we're all going to be impacted by that in terms of whether it's writers writing publications or whatever. There's going to be a lot more transparency. There's going to be a lot more data out there. One of Ben's basic arguments, to follow this line of thought for a moment, is Ben saying everything should be published. Well, that's an awful lot of work to be done by somebody, and arguably there's a lot of medical writing, medcoms type work to be done. So, from that point of view, I've said to many people when I've run my meetings about careers in the medcoms industry, I basically said, this isn't a business that's going away. There's a mountain of data that needs to be written up and communicated, and therefore, from that point of view, there's a great business here. Some of the things I've already touched on in terms of how that business is being presented and executed, I think makes it interesting to speculate over the next few years how the business is going to change. But there is no doubt, medical writers, especially, are going to be in demand for a long time, yeah.